Welcome to See You on the Other Side, where the world of the mysterious collides with the world of entertainment. A discussion of art, music, movies, spirituality, the weird, and self-discovery. And now, your hosts, musicians and entertainers who have their own weakness for the weird, Mike and Wendy from the band Sunspot.
Wendy, when I say fairies, what do you think of?
I think of little mystical, magical creatures with wings, kind of like the ones that was it Sir Arthur Conan Doyle that did the
yes, the Cottingley.
I think of those, fairies. And I think of Grimm's fairy tales that include all kinds of that type of creature. Might think of Tinkerbell a little bit.
Yeah, like I would say that kind of thing. I mean, that's our modern idea of the fairies. Is that idea of the little winged people that live in the forest, and they're fun, and you know they could be like leprechauns. Like leprechauns, They're not that bad. They're friendly.
They're cute.
Yeah,
and magical.
I mean, not the leprechaun from the movie Leprechaun. Like he's not cute and magic. I mean, he's magical, but he ain't cute.
I bet his mom thinks he's cute.
That's true. I bet his fairy mother thinks. But I really think about that. You know, we've had this idea. Like I feel like that fairies have tricked us over the past 100 or so years to think of them as friends instead of enemies.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the whole thing, because people didn't think of fairies as happy fun time 500 years ago. They thought of them as these strange creatures that lived in the forest, and they would come in and they would, they lived at the mercy of the fairies.
They were like little pranksters.
Yeah.
They'd mess with you.
Or worse, and we're going to talk about the worst stuff in this episode today. If you want to see maybe a version of the fairies that's more in line with the traditional idea of it, I got to recommend this movie called The Hallow.
Ooh,
and
I haven't heard of it.
It's an Irish film from a couple of years ago, and it presents the fairies in a new kind of way. I don't want to talk too much about it, because it's a great horror movie.
No spoilers.
No spoilers. But check out The Hallow for a different idea of fairies.
Okay. Maybe we'll have to watch it for one of our Patreon hangout discussions.
Yeah, that's a good one.
In the future.
There's also an episode of Torchwood where they deal with fairies, and they actually deal with this very specific thing, where the lead character actually has to make a deal with the fairies in order to get somebody back. But it's interesting because, I think fairies just have the best public relations people of all. Because they totally work. Like Tinkerbell's sweet. Your fairy godmother grants you wishes.
Right.
Your fairy godmother does not steal your baby and replace your baby with like a sickly half copy.
Let's hope not.
Yeah. Well, today we're welcoming Josh Cutchin. We've had him on the show before. And, he's written about supernatural foods. He's written about supernatural odors. We talk about this in the interview.
He's provided us with all kinds of supernatural, paranormal content.
Yeah, and so we talk a little bit about how I feel about Josh's work. In the interview, Allison from Milwaukee Ghost joins us for this one, and because she loves Josh, all of his work and everything. And so it's a super interesting interview. He's a super fun guy, and his research is painstaking, which makes it exciting to talk to him.
Oh, we love that kind of author.
Mm-hmm. And this time, he's gone for not a sense like you think, okay, we have supernatural foods, supernatural smells. Do we now have supernatural touches? Or is it, is it going to be supernatural? I can't even, what other senses do we, supernatural audio? No, he goes for the jugular in this one, as he explores child abduction, supernatural stories across cultures over the years. And it's a very sensitive subject, but he deals with it well. And let's go talk to Joshua Cutchin about his new book, Thieves in the Night. Fortean author Joshua Cutchin wrote the groundbreaking A Trojan Feast, the food and drink offerings of aliens, fairies, and Sasquatch in 2015 to examine millennia of strange cross-cultural paranormal food taboos. Following it up with The Brimstone Deceit, an in-depth examination of supernatural scents, otherworldly odors, and monstrous miasmas, Joshua explored olfactory experiences reported during paranormal encounters. Today, he joins us to talk about perhaps his most frightening work to date, his new book, Thieves in the Night, which examines the disturbing history of paranormal child abduction. Thank you, Joshua. It's wonderful to talk to a fellow Badger again.
Always an absolute pleasure to speak with y'all. You're always a highlight whenever I do one of these interview circuits, so I appreciate it.
Oh, you're a highlight too. We just love your work.
Absolutely. I think your work's awesome. And I got to say, Brimstone Deceit changed the way I think about paranormal activity.
Oh, that's quite flattering. I really appreciate it.
And I must have talked about this in a dozen podcasts, but I'll just summarize it here. That scent of sulfur in all these different encounters, from Bigfoot to UFOs to fairies to all these different things you talked about in your book, made me rethink my theory on what paranormal experiences could be. And that idea that that smell of sulfur is like that's how we enter program mode. That's the aliens, or that's machinery elves, or whatever like that.
That's your trigger.
That's our trigger, and all of a sudden we remember it as whatever we decide to believe in, whether it's Bigfoot or whether it's a UFO. So that entire thing gave me a whole theory on paranormal activity that I didn't have before. So thank you, Joe.
Well, you're welcome. It's an idea worth considering. You know, I vacillate sometimes between whether or not I believe it myself, or I think that it's. But I think there's something there. It's not sure what. So
right. So just to get in real quick, what inspired you to attack this particular topic? Because as a new parent myself, not really new, about 20 months though, but as a parent myself, and the idea, like, there's a visceral reaction to the idea of anything happening to your child. Like, it's like, you just feel that mama bear. Oh, I don't feel the mama bear instinct, but
Papa
the Papa
bear.
You know, depending on my mood, it could be the mama bear. But any little piece, like anything happening to your kid, like drives you instinctually mad. So this is the kind of topic that's pretty challenging. What attracted you to it?
Part of it was that everyone was thinking I was going to do something about sound or touch or something else, right, sense related. So in my experience, when everybody thinks you're going to zig, it's usually a good idea to zag, keep it fresh. So that was part of it. Part of it was me thinking about, because as much as I enjoyed writing the Brimstone Deceit, and as proud as I am of it, I had to, by nature of the subject matter, really dig into chemistry, which is not something that I was ever enthusiastic about as a student. So I sort of sat back and said, well, what really does get me excited? And that's really fairy lore. So it was partially that. It was also partially the fact that it's probably no secret that I'm not particularly bullish on the extraterrestrial hypothesis as an explanation for the contact experience. I think that I'm open to the idea that there's been extraterrestrial visitation to Earth in the past, but I don't think it describes the lion's share of a lot of entity encounters that people have. So, being somebody who sort of ascribes to a non-ETH paradigm, I realize if I'm going to be intellectually honest, I have to address what I thought of the sort of modern hybrid program theory that you find in a lot of contact lore. Mm-hmm. And part of me sort of just thought it was nonsense. And I'm like, that's not fair, because there's obviously something there. There's a consistency to a lot of these reports. So, deal with it. Find a way to sort of fit that into your paradigm and see if it changes the way that you think about these things as well. So it was sort of an outgrowth of all those things. And of course, the hybrid thing is naturally, it has some comparisons, some that a lot of people have noticed, and some that I think are a little bit lesser noticed, with some parallels to the changeling lore.
We got to talk about that.
Yeah, especially in the British Isles.
We should start with that for people who aren't familiar with the fairy changeling lore and the idea of it, and the idea of fairies coming in and stealing your kid and replacing it. Can you do just a quick 101 for people who may not be familiar with the idea of the fairy changeling?
Absolutely. So it's an idea, it's a concept that you'll find in a lot of worldwide cultures, but it's especially pronounced in the British Isles and Scandinavia and Germanic countries as well. It's the concept that beings from the other world, I'm going to try to keep this as generic as possible, beings from the other world will steal a healthy human child and replace it with something different. The way that this manifests, particularly in fairy lore, is the idea that the fairies themselves need providing genetic material to bolster and improve the health of their own race, which, of course, if anybody's familiar with, UFO hybrid theories, that should sound familiar. But the idea that the fairies would take a healthy human baby and leave behind either a sickly fairy child, an elderly fairy person, or some bit of worthless rubbish in its place, cloaked with glamour to appear as a child. And the idea was that people would be saddled with these sickly, unhealthy, peevish sort of children that weren't their own at all. And from that, you have an entire culture of often barbaric means of resolving this sort of trauma that people would have, where they would perceive, whether or not it's true or not, and there's some nuance there that we can get into as well, but where they would perceive this other alien child in their midst. There was sort of an entire culture of prescriptions to retrieve your child, to expel this child of the other world, and to return your life to normal. So that's the way that the narrative typically played out in Western Europe, for example.
Well, that's really interesting to me, too, because just you talking about that brought up the idea, and you can even hear that from parents of autistic kids who say, when they, like the whole anti-vaxxer thing is that they took the vaccination and the next day, that wasn't my child. Or it's not the same kid that it was the day before. And I guess I never even thought of that connection to, whatever side you land on or whatever side people believe and stuff like that. That idea that this is going back millennia, that one day my kid is a certain way and the next day that's not my child.
Right. And, it's because this book, more than other books that I've written, deals with a lot of sensitive issues. And I try to speak with some friends of mine who have children with disabilities and ask them, am I handling this in a sensitive way? Because I think that one of the biggest problems facing a lot of paranormal researchers and authors and whatnot is they want to say that everything is one thing. They want to say that every anomalous light in the sky is an alien, or that every sighting of something shaggy in the woods is Sasquatch. And I come from the school of thought.
Not saying it's aliens, but it's aliens.
I'm not saying it's fairies, but it's fairies. I come from the school of thought that that probably 80%, well, that's probably a little bit high. The lion's share of, for example, lights in the sky are misidentification. Then there's another portion, a smaller percentage, that are misunderstood natural phenomena, perhaps that we don't understand yet. An equal or smaller percentage that are basically unorthodox or secret military aircraft. And then there's a genuinely anomalous, significant percentage of sightings as well. So I think that you can sort of look at the fairy changeling. You can look at the fairy changeling phenomena in a similar way. Like, I think, honestly, a good portion of these are sort of uneducated attempts for the culture at the time to describe a host of congenital disabilities. And one chapter, a pretty long chapter in the book, details a lot of different candidates, because there have literally been dozens of candidates proposed through the years to describe this sort of changeling phenomena. One of the more persistent ones, one of the more popular ones, is autism, as you mentioned, especially regressive autism, where a child seems to be developing functionally and then all of a sudden has a pretty large setback. So I think a lot of it is that. I think some of it represents a genuine contact with the other world, and I think probably the more controversial idea. I think some of it might actually be both. That there is something extra paraphysical going on, in addition to an actual physical or mental disability that's taking place in the person as well.
So a lot of these, legends and fairy lore and folklore that's around it, it's our usual explanation of what the savages did in the past. We talk about what happened, in the those people who needed Carl Sagan's candle in the dark to get outside their demon-haunted world. And we have that all in our heads of the way people in the past lived and what they believed, and they were superstitious and uneducated,
and how much more advanced we are. That's a conceit that we have in modernity.
Yeah, even though the DSM changes every couple of years, there are no blank spots on the mental map anymore. It's always like, oh no, we have everything figured out as a species, as a culture, which is it's hubris, I think.
That's a great point you just made, Josh. What he was referring to out there is the American Psychological Association has this diagnostic and statistical manual that comes out every few years. And I remember when I was in college, we studied, the DSM-4. And since then, it's been the DSM-5. And all these things that were in the DSM-4 that I learned when I was in college and taking a psychology major, that might have been classified as disorders or might have been classified as something pathological, has now converted to, well, that's just kind of the way it is, or things change. And even in our modern world, we're constantly changing that.
Well, and a great many of those things that people go through are only known to the psychological community, psychiatric community, through anecdotes and personal experience. I can tell you how I feel, and then that we build, a disorder around that. So I think that something like the DSM is a really parsimonious microcosm of what people in the supernatural realm are talking about. The fact that personal experience does matter and perception does matter, and the fact that we, even if we think we're doing our best to understand and represent the world around us, we're constantly learning new things. So yeah, that's a little tangent there.
Yeah, but I think it's a valuable thing to think about because as you mentioned just there, where do you think we get science from? It's from listening to people's experiences. I was talking with a skeptic friend, not so long ago, and he said, well, Al, I told him an extraordinary experience I had. And, really, I explain away just everything. And finally, I had something where I'm like, nope. I don't think that would be disingenuous to explain that away because really I can't. And he said, and I answered to that, well, Allison, I've learned not to trust my senses or my perceptions. And I'm like, dude, I understand what you're saying there because there are optical illusions, but there are all kinds of illusions, let's just say. But if you didn't pay attention to experience, then we wouldn't have any science or any basis of knowledge at all.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good point too. Perception is the basis of science, like you said, and some things are more easily to demonstrate for people's perceptions. Some things are more replicable than others.
Absolutely.
It's generally ball lightning, which was sort of laughed at one point, is generally accepted as a genuine phenomena nowadays, but it's impossible to replicate. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. So it's somebody that I follow and am internet friends with. Magician Gordon White once said that you don't measure quarterback's performance in a laboratory and you don't measure tides in a sink. So you have to there's certain parameters that have to be met that can't be met in the replicability of a laboratory, and that's a major stumbling block.
That's a great way to put it. And I just wanted to ask you, Josh, you had mentioned something there before that fairy lore, that's what really motivated you and excited you. And I really love reading about fairies too. And I just wanted to ask, what about the fairies gets to you?
So I have to sort of do a gut check every now and then, because I think that at one point, the term fairy was used basically the way that we use paranormal or supernatural now. So in other words, they'd say, oh, that's fairy. So it's easy to go down this rabbit hole of everything seeming like it's all fairy lore, which I'm guilty of myself. So I sort of had to check myself for that. But at the same time, there are specific things that were attributed to the fairies, as opposed to just this sort of concept of fairy in general. The fairies, the fae folk, the good folk, that are highly resonant with the modern UFO contact experience. There was a point where I wasn't sure if they were really sort of describing the same thing. I'm sort of the opinion now that they're definitely describing the same thing. Does that mean that we're misinterpreting alien abduction as fair? Does it mean that the people of the past, were misinterpreting alien abduction as fairy abduction, or does it mean that we are misinterpreting fairy abduction as alien abduction? I don't know. I actually am kind of fond of the idea that neither of them are accurately describing what we're going through. But I think it's that sort of explicative power and these little resonances that you find that are really shocking. One thing, for example, something that I, for the longest time, thought that there was no real analog for in fairy lore It's something I briefly touch upon in the book, which if I could do it again, I'd probably go into it in a little bit more detail. But this idea of the fairy blast. So if you look at the etymology of the word blast, blustery, a blast of wind, the idea that fairies traveled on whirlwinds, and if you offended them, you would get hit with a fairy blast that also turned into a blister, which is, again, it's the same etymology here. In this sort of blister, this fairy blast blister, would manifest as either a blister or a tumor or a lump, and inside would be detritus. And it's one of those things where I was like, that's kind of an analog for the modern, alien implant phenomenon.
Yeah.
Even more interesting, I found some tales from Newfoundland where fairy blasts tended to manifest in strings sticking out of the wound, which sounded to me like Morgellons.
Yes.
Which I don't know enough about Morgellons. May or may not be a thing. May or may not be tied to alien abduction, but people have said that it is. So it just, when you get to that level of specificity, I feel like I can say with confidence something talked about in either UFO lore or fairy lore is going to be mirrored in the other one to some degree. And to me, that really reinforces the fact that we're dealing with the same big kettle of fish.
And sometimes other phenomena as well, because you just mentioned that Morgellons thing, where, is a controversial malady.
Right.
They're still debating, whether it's true or not. But there's a lot of people, even high profile people like Joni Mitchell, who claim to have suffered from it. But, essentially you have these fibrous protrusions from your skin. And I was reading an exorcism case about the possession of someone from our area from the 19th century. And it talked about the different, in this article I found, it talked about the different things that were done, to try to assist him. And one doctor came in, a native doctor, and applied these compresses to this possessed person. And then when he took off the compress, there were all these fibers coming out of his skin. I'll send you that one. But I was like, my God, because it's just, for me, when I do research, I'm always looking into the past. It sounds like what I'm doing is similar to what you are doing as well. As, I'm not necessarily, what's happening, the actual occurrences, they're not easily quantified or qualified or categorized. But, if you can look in the past and look at past documentation and see these strange confirmations of things that are being reported today, I think that's some kind of evidence.
Well, I want to go back here real quick and just emphasize how gross this stuff is we're talking about. So when you're talking about a fairy blast, you're talking about a fairy blast, you're talking about a blister. And when you pop that blister, there's something on the inside.
Yeah,
when
basically.
you have a zit with
gift.
a string attached, you have a pimple with a string attached, and that's Morgellons. So let's just realize that we're just like, a fairy blast. A fairy blast sounds like something we're going to get at the Dairy Queen. That we're like, hell yeah, I want a fairy blast, and I'll take some extra M&Ms on it, or whatever. We're talking about a blister that when you pop the blister, instead of pus, out comes some extra crap that you don't know what it is.
It's like a David Cronenberg film or something.
Yeah.
Exactly. There's serious body horror issues involved here that I want to make sure everybody gets through their head before we switch topics.
Yeah, I wish that this pop culture idea of what fairies are is just something that you just constantly have to battle. I think that I was joking with somebody the other night that it's like the only thing that's more embarrassing than saying that you're interested in UFOs is that you're interested in fairies, because people jump to the Tinkerbell thing and you'll be like, no, it's not that cut and dry. It's been a severe misrepresentation. But back to what Allison was talking about too, I think comparativism is really where it's at. And I think that's sort of the way that you win over a lot of hearts and minds in the skeptical community, at least among my friends too, is to say, look, I'm not saying I know, I'm not saying it's aliens. No, I'm not saying I know what this is, but I'm saying that you have a lot of consistencies through cultures that should not have cross-pollinated.
Yeah.
So does that mean that, these are human archetypes that we all manifest somehow? I mean, that's sort of the tamer possibility, really.
Yeah.
Which is still not, people sometimes poo-poo that in the paranormal community, but even if that's true, I mean, that's a life-changing, reality-altering possibility itself, that we all manifest these deep-seated anxieties, among human beings. So yeah, I think that comparativism is to be able to compare and to say, I don't know what this is, and I don't know what this is, but they seem to be describing the same thing. I think that's what really floats my boat.
Yeah, there's definite data there. People are always asking you, where's the data? Look at the data. What you serve up, Joshua, is the data. And yeah, that's exciting.
What I like here, though, is that we're not just, when we talk about cross-cultural fears and stuff, like every human being is going to be afraid that their child is going to be abducted. But the thing is, it's not just the realistic fears. Like if you live in Oklahoma, you can realistically be afraid of a tornado.
Right.
If you live in a jungle or whatever, you can be afraid of the weird diseases and huge animals and stuff like that are in the jungle, and I'm afraid of a tiger I'm afraid of a dingo eating my baby. Like I am afraid of these things, which are real tangible things. You can be afraid of another tribe coming in, like they ran out of kids or whatever. They're coming in to steal children for the next generation. That's a real thing to be afraid of. To be afraid of a fairy sneaking into your house, grabbing your kid and leaving a simulacrum of your child that is sickly and fake in his or her place. And to have that be across cultures, that's something I think is remarkable, what we're talking about here. Because we think of people in the past age as being superstitious and everything, but remember, they also had to be incredibly pragmatic. Because unlike us, they had to deal with death on a daily different basis. I have never, besides a funeral home, I've never seen a dead person in real life.
Right.
You know what I mean? And I'm 41 years old. And think about the kind of stuff you would see if you're in a tribe of 150 people 2,000 years ago. It's just completely different experience. And so I think we need to acknowledge a little bit of that when we go into why are these different cultures experiencing the same thing? And also, can you get into some of the cross-cultural stuff you find in your book, John?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I say at one point in the book that I feel like this sort of touches on what you were talking about. I feel like explaining the changeling phenomena purely with medicine makes as much sense as explaining folklore with medicine makes as much sense as explaining medicine with folklore. And by that, I mean that if you're purely looking at, this idea that changelings were, every example of the changeling phenomena represented a congenital birth defect or something along those lines, you are really robbing that sort of concept of a lot of its explicative power in terms of what it says about the way that these people live their lives socially, economically, the sort of pressures that were put on the family. I mean, again, that's all without going into the paranormal field, which I do think that there's, again, a sort of grain of truth to that as well. Just to give an idea, I always like to talk about this statistic because it's incredibly shocking. If there's a book that came out by this lady named Elaine Farrell, A Most Diabolical Deed, that looked at infanticide just in Ireland, which of course is an island that's about the size of Indiana, just between 1850 and 1900. So it's a 50-year period. Only children murdered less than 3 years old. She found 4,645 cases in a 50-year period. Just children under 3. So if they're 3 years and 1 day, she didn't include them in her survey. So it's that's a psychocultural aspect that has to be looked at. The idea that families had resource strain put on them that they couldn't deal with, and this was sort of in some instances a scapegoat. So that's one way to look at it. Another thing that frustrates me with looking at the changeling phenomena purely through a medical lens is that a lot of times medical ailments were caused by the supernatural. They didn't mean that the person that had them was supernatural. For example, a witch might cause a cleft palate, but someone with a cleft palate wasn't a witch. It was understood as a medically treatable condition. So I think that, you had mentioned sort of this idea that we look upon our ancestors as being sort of backwards and primitive. I think that we sometimes do them a disservice in that respect. But in terms of sort of the cross-cultural implications, you'll find fairy lore amongst pretty much any any region's indigenous people. For example, I just read the other day that there is not a single First Nations tribe in the Americas that doesn't have some sort of belief in some sort of fairy type people. And cross-culturally, they're almost always short in stature, subterranean dwelling, and love to take children. And you'll find this, for example, there's a version of a sort of African changeling. It's not quite a changeling, but it's got a lot of the hallmarks of it. Among the Yoruba of Nigeria and Benin, it's called the Abiku, which are the race of these elemental spirits who will actually take up residence in a pregnant woman's belly, and will actually substitute their spirit for the spirit of the human child, and will come out, and their job is to make the parents just feel awful, like have a shortened lifespan, and to just be really peevish and cantankerous. And the idea is that the more money that they throw at getting their child to feel better, that's money that this Abiku will actually take into the afterlife. So it's sort of like a get rich quick scheme for this little changeling. And it's interesting because there's so many parallels between that and sort of the changeling motif. You know, even if you look outside Western Europe, you'll see these things. Something that's really interesting. We mentioned this idea of the fairy blast, this idea that the fairies could travel on winds. The Hopi of the American Southwest felt that whirlwinds could cause miscarriages. You know, of course, the British fairies would come in on a whirlwind and abduct people, especially children. So there's sort of a parallel there as well. You'll find that similar beliefs regarding whirlwinds amongst both Jews and Muslims in the Middle East. These are not cultures that should have discussed or had this transmission of shared cultural beliefs. Similarly, one of the most efficacious means of preventing child abduction in the first place was the implementation of iron, which you'll find literally all across the world. You'll find it in India. You'll find people driving iron nails into trees in China. And you'll, of course, find some really striking stories of people in the British Isles leaving scissors in the bed of children or dangling. My scariest one was, I believe it was in Yorkshire. There was a child who had an iron knife dangled right above its nose in its crib to protect them from the fairies.
Everybody doesn't do that.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I got one in just the other room. I could walk over there and take it out and cut a steak with it.
Well, that's, we were talking about why I'd sort of come to this book and also like what sort of inspired me to write it. I kind of wanted to write something because people heard that I wrote books about the paranormal and supernatural, and neither of my first books are really that unsettling or scary. And I wanted to write something that was a little bit more, made me a little bit squeamish, and was sort of a little bit more creepy. And this book takes you to some dark places. I mean, when you find yourself writing about the harvesting and gold leaf plating of fetuses in Thailand for black magic purposes, you know that your life has taken a strange and possibly wrong turn. Oh my God. It's just dark stuff. And a lot of the means of prescribing, the most common cross-cultural means of ridding yourself of a changeling was abuse. I mean, it was, for example, in the case of, we'll return to the British Isles in a second, but for the case of the Abiku, after the child was dead, you would slice its skin and stuff hot peppers inside and spices that supposedly would make the spirit of the deceased alien otherworld child put them in pain. But in other parts of Western Europe, you saw children being abandoned, burned, boiled, drowned, all in this effort to quote unquote put the fairy out of them. A lot of people have talked about parallels between the UFO abduction experience and changelings in terms of the way that the alien hybrids look like, in terms of their appearance whenever people are introduced. But there are a lot of other little bits and pieces here and there that are connective to the modern hybrid theory that I don't think people have really realized. And abuse is one of them. I think that there is some sort of through line between children suspected of being fairy babies being abused, miraculously returning, whether or not that's a depossession of the child or, the child has been snapped back from an altered state of consciousness, but the child returns and now has often a spiritual sort of path in their life. Plenty of children rescued from the fairy realm would grow to become ministers, or they would have special abilities like telekinesis and clairvoyance. Well, one of the things that John Mack pointed out was the prevalence of alien abductees to have abuse earlier in their lives. And what do alien abductees often come back with? They often come back with a more spiritual bent. They often come back with not often talked about, but profound synchronicities, telekinesis, less telekinesis, but more telepathy, poltergeist activity in their homes, all those sort of things. Abuse is also a strong component of the shamanic path in indigenous cultures. People would have a sort of brush with death as an early child, be taken to the spirit world, and after that point, they would be on a spiritual path and would be able to have certain ideas about, where the herds of animals were moving for the hunt and what the weather was going to be like, and would act as spiritual intercessors for the tribe. So that's a consistency that I think has sort of gone underappreciated between changelings and alien abductees and shamanic initiates.
Well, number one, that's, terrifying and dark in its own kind of way, because we even think about, one of my friends was a paranormal investigator in this group in Milwaukee, and he eventually, he had a criminal justice major, and he eventually, after going on a dozen investigations, was like, these are all just child abuse cases, and I can't even take it anymore. And so that idea of, I've always had that idea then that sometimes when people talk about poltergeist cases, or they, even in famous cases like the Enfield poltergeist, a lot of times they are, it seems to be a paranormal thing covering up some kind of abuse.
Yes.
Even the demon house in Indiana, where you talk about the kind of lives that those kids had led before, starting to exhibit paranormal phenomena and possession and things like that. It's not like those kids had a Leave It to Beaver existence.
Right.
And so you think about that, and, the first thing that comes to my mind is always the thing, parents do some gnarly stuff to their children, horrible things, and then, it's the fairies' fault, or it's the poltergeist fault.
Yeah, there's no question, and I try to sort of bang this drum in the book that a lot of times this was an excuse for people to have one less mouth to feed. Can you imagine in this scenario of bringing in the medically afflicted child into changeling lore? You're in the middle of a famine, and you have a child that is born with a mental disability, is never going to be able to help around the family farm, and yet is going to be one more plate to serve at dinner. What do you do in that scenario? Well, a lot of people found this as a way to socially acceptably get rid of their children. There was a grandmother, I believe in County Tipperary, who actually was acquitted for drowning her grandchild, by a trial jury, was found not guilty because she was legitimately believed that she was trying to rid herself of the fairy. So
when you're talking about 1850 to 1900, and you were talking about 1850 to 1900 in Ireland, that's the end of the potato famine.
Yeah.
That's what we talk about. Even Allison and our own Irish ancestors, they're like, no potatoes, we're out of here.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that people talk about the potato famine in the U.S., but if you really do some research on how profound that was for Ireland, it's astonishing. And of course, I think even there were people who even blamed the potato famine on fairies. This idea that this blight swept through the land and it was caused by angry fairy folk. But yeah, I want to, and I've tried to emphasize the fact that a lot of this is just garbage people doing garbage things to their children. The question is, whether or not trauma, you see this in near-death experiencers too, who return with, increased abilities. Does trauma somehow, serve a purpose in some people's lives, which I think is a nice counter to, this very Western, physicalist idea that suffering has no value. Does trauma serve some purpose in the greater scheme of things? And does it perhaps by being closer to the veil, does it facilitate communication of somehow with that extended consciousness realm? I don't know. I think that sometimes it might, but like you said, I think that no, I don't think there is no shortage of people who took advantage of this to do absolutely horrible things.
And so then what do you think is some of the most cases when you were exploring this and when you were looking at different cases in your research, to you, what are the most, not necessarily convincing, but surprising things that you found when you were exploring this book? Like you said, like it's easy to dismiss all these things in a lot of ways. Like you said, the physicalist mindset, the materialist mindset that you're like, okay, well, this is just going to be abuse, or this is just going to be autism, or this is just going to, like, when you were looking in, what did you find that you were like, oh man, I can't believe this?
Yeah, what were the unexplained things that you found?
There's a great case of a servant girl from 1645 by the name of Anne Jeffreys. And part of the reason that she is interesting is because she wasn't necessarily a changeling, but she did claim to be abducted by the fairies. Part of the thing that you have to parse out when you look at fairy abduction specifically is that it was often used as a euphemism and sometimes believed to be the cause or underlying cause of illness or death. So if a child died, sometimes they weren't dead. They were just taken by the fairies, which I think has a lot of importance and a lot of bearing on sort of this combination between fairies and the dead, which doesn't get talked about, I don't think, enough. But this idea that for example, there's an ancient poem that says that after someone dies, there are three roads: one to heaven, one to hell, and one to fairyland. So while not endorsing the idea of this as limbo, the idea that, perhaps that's another place that the soul can go, or, staying here on our realm, on our earthly plane, while in spirit form is sort of fairyland. But
oh, that's a perfect idea, though, because the idea that if a child hasn't been baptized yet, they have to go to, that's, the Catholic idea that they go to limbo, this place between heaven and hell, because they haven't been baptized, so they're not Christian yet, so they can't just go into and be accepted by Jesus. But they didn't do anything bad because they're innocent, so they can't go to hell either and be punished by the devil. So they go to this place in the middle, this limbo. And the idea of when you die, I'd pick fairyland every time, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because, in some cultures, for example, in Cornwall, unbaptized children who passed away became pixies. In almost every fairy tradition, where there's a Christian culture dominating, fairies had the most power over children in the liminal stage of being unbaptized. After birth, before baptism, that's when children were most at risk of being abducted. Anne Jeffreys is interesting because she's sort of an outlier. She had fallen ill, as opposed to being abused or actually apparently being in a unsuitable household. And while she was ill, she said that she was actually among the fairies, which to me sort of suggests that means that she was in an altered state of consciousness. And while she was there, she took a fairy lover who actually spurned some jealousy, or caused some jealousy among some of the other fairies, who eventually, in their jealous rage, covered her eyes, and she heard a sound like a millions of flies buzzing in her ears, which that buzzing sound can be heard in both altered states of consciousness and the modern UFO abduction scenario. But when she returned, she had the ability to heal through touch and clairvoyance, and for years people would visit her as sort of a curer and a prophetess and whatnot. So I think that's one of the more compelling cases because there is a historical record. I mean, a lot of these changeling stories sit at this weird intersection of folklore and fiction and a little bit of truth. But whenever you can find a story like that that talks about fairy abduction in a very tangible way, I think that suggests that there's a little more something going on. There was also a child from oh Lord, I believe it was Wales, by the name of Giddo Bach, who was a young child who loved to sort of ramble around the countryside and would often disappear and claim that he was playing with fairies. And one day he disappeared, and 2 years later he reappeared, having not aged a day, on his mother's doorstep in the same clothes, saying that he had been dancing with the fairies. So it's cases like that I find, I think that if you mix cases like that are a little bit more credible, if you mix those with this underlying changeling medical phenomena reality, I think you might start to approximate something that gets to a little bit more of an objective truth about what's going on in these cases.
Well, when you're talking about the fairy lover, the first thing I thought of was a Wisconsin author in the King Killer series, the whole Kvoth, in the second book, The Wise Man's Fear, I think it's called, the sequel to The Name of the Wind. He spends like 6 months in fairyland, and it's all about making love to fairies. So this, because like the idea, like the fairy lover, like, well, even the same, is everything compatible? Does all the equipment work? I mean, this idea that Anne Jeffries went over to the other side and someone took a liking to her in a romantic interest kind of way. I mean, that there you go with the alien abductions and the women being impregnated by the UFO and stuff. And then what happens is there's jealousy, and then she's forced back or things. I mean, there's a lot of connections, I think, to people's modern sense of, what happens when you're in the belly of the spacecraft.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And that, that sort of motif of mixing bloodlines with the other world can be found in, obviously, you think about the ideas of the Nephilim in the Bible, and in Eastern traditions, the idea that emperors would have the blood of the dragon mixed into their bloodline. I even found an Indian case, a pretty old Indian case, where it was believed in folklore that a mysterious man would steal a woman in a whirlwind and take her up to the highest top of a tree and make love to her and give her this half human child. So it's a really common motif, and I do feel, like you said, I feel like it's a little bit. You have to acknowledge that there's a similarity between modern UFO lore and those older cases. And our physicalist, science fiction drenched, I would say reductive, sort of Western paradigm is that we want to make these into little scientists in spacecraft. But I think that, very rarely do people often entertain the idea that the gods were aliens, but they rarely entertain the idea that the aliens are gods, because that's superstitious, which is just, kind of have to chuckle at.
Another one for your whirlwind thing. In Oneida tradition, actually in the larger Haudenosaunee tradition, people commonly call them the Iroquois, but that's not what they call themselves. So the Haudenosaunee people, which includes the Oneida, the Mohawk, there's 6 nations.
The whole confederation.
Actually. Yeah, the confederation. Right. Yeah, they're the creation story, the Sky a Woman creation story, includes Sky Woman's daughter being impregnated by the west wind. So
Interesting.
I think, and that's how the twins, who ultimately were the creators, came about, is through being impregnated by the daughter being impregnated by the west wind.
Well, we've all seen that great Marilyn Monroe picture, right? With
yeah,
knocking up her skirt. What do you think the wind's doing? The wind's a perv.
Yep.
So, Joshua, do you have any kind of quick bestiary you could give us, about the most frightening or disturbing stories you've run into cross-culturally regarding child abduction?
Yeah, I mean, it's
all pretty frightening.
Yeah, it's all really unsettling. We've spent a lot of this time talking about the fairy side of things, but I think a lot of because it hits a little bit closer to home, the concept of UFO abduction is just as unsettling, because you get some real really quite innocent descriptions of these encounters, which just shouldn't have this consistency and shouldn't be this unsettling. I mean, I opened the book with a story about a child who was in California and noticed his mom's copy of Bud Hopkins' Intruders and started telling these stories about, those being his people that used to take him aboard spacecrafts where he was born and would poke him and prod him and fly him out the window and then return him back to bed. And he was actually speaking with a UFO investigator, and he said that after some time that the child sort of clammed up because he knew that his friends would get mad at him for speaking with the UFO investigator, which is, that's the point in the film where, the strings kick in and the pizzicato.
Right. Things change. Act 3 starts, and then it's now we're down to where the aliens are going to come after it.
Yeah, exactly. Trying to think of some other stuff right off the top of my head. You talk about the whirlwind aspect, which I think maybe if you want to at some point talk about the David Paulides missing 411 stuff, because I think that ties in and is germane to this as well. But
I would love to talk about that, because we were talking about cases essentially in antiquity, and then up to the 19th century, and then that case that you opened the book with, that was in the 80s, right?
Right.
And so stuff is still going on when you talk
absolutely.
about missing 411.
Yeah, it's interesting. The effects upon people, are very consistent, but the means by which these things happen always change. I guess what I'm thinking about specifically is this idea that you had fairies, and then you had people in airships, and then you had sort of the contactee era, which was characterized by voluntary experiences that were really quite pleasant, and then this all sort of morphed into the alien abduction era, where you had these unpleasant experiences that were very involuntary, non-consensual. And now I sort of suspect that the missing 411 thing is kind of another unfolding of this sort of concept of people and quite a lot of children who disappear. And if you look at a lot of these cases, a lot of the criteria, I mean, it's sort of like a paranormal Rorschach test, right? It says more about what you're interested in than it does objectively what's happening.
Right.
And so I realize the irony in saying that it seems to map on irony in me saying that it seems to map onto fairy lore more closely than anything else. I mean, it's established at length that fairies tend to be more active in inclement weather, which is something you find in a lot of these missing 411 cases. They had a preference for intelligent males, which you'll see in some of these missing 411 cases. Similarly, you'll find, in some of the missing 411 cases, people with mental disabilities disappear. Oftentimes, they're the ones who are found because they can't articulate what's happened to them, which, of course, that sort of ties into what we've been talking about with changelings and that sort of cognitive, sort of a congenital disability idea. You will find that people returning, if they are found, are in a trance. You'll find if people are found dead, they'll often be missing articles of clothing. Well, one of the means of returning from fairyland, if you found yourself there, was to take off your clothes and invert them. Not saying that everybody is aware of this, but maybe that's describing something that people are compelled to do when they're in this state or something.
But that is sometimes when people find people dead or whatever, they'll with the clothes inside out,
right.
It looks like the clothes were put back on them.
Right.
The idea, and the clothes are put back on them incorrectly. Like the fairies don't know about tags.
Yeah, exactly. You'll find,
tag goes on the inside, guys.
Of alien abductions where people are wearing clothes inside out too, which, I don't know if that means, it's just one of those things that supposedly it's, who knows, maybe something about doing that, the inversion of the normal facilitates a return from the other world. But you'll find a prevalence of streams and boulders in missing 411 cases, people disappearing in those, which are traditionally fairy environments. I mean, it's been something that's a fact that gets propped up a lot and talked about a lot, but I think it's still worth saying is that, in Iceland, they still, divert roads around boulders that are supposedly fairy houses. It's a very close association with that as well. And then something that Paulides himself said, there seem to be a lot of people who disappear while berry picking. Well, if you look in the literature, that's one of the most common places to encounter berries. Fairies around berries.
Berries like berries.
Fairies love berries. There's a wonderful book that I recommend for anybody who's interested called The Good People. It's a collection of essays, and the editor of the essay collection actually contributes a chapter that's all about berry picking in fairy lore in Newfoundland, because there's a large transmission of Irish culture over to that part of the world, and we're talking about like maybe just shy of 24 cases, modern 20th century cases, where children are found in a daze after visiting berry bushes, and when they can remember, they talked about encountering these little people who brought them back. Also, kids who went to go berry picking and disappeared as well. So, I think but at the same time, it's disheartening because I see all these parallels with this that honestly I think map on better than a serial killer roaming the national parks. Honestly, map on better than Bigfoot somehow managing to control the weather. Map on somehow better than aliens hanging around berry bushes. But I don't see a lot of people really talking about how this is kind of the piece of this is the jigsaw puzzle piece that almost fits. There are some rough edges and you kind of have to wedge it in there a little bit, but I don't see a lot of people talking about that. And I think that part of that's that fairy stigma, the idea that you hear fairy tales and you're like, oh, ha, 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 fairies, but
right. Yeah. And David Paulides, he doesn't attribute anything in specific for all these disappearances, but and that's what we're talking about here. If you're new to the missing 411, David Paulides is this researcher who has looked into disappearances in the national parks, over decades, and found some really unsettling comparisons between those disappearances. And so one of those things is, was the kid near a berry bush? Was the kid the last in the line? What was the kid wearing? Like certain colors.
Certain colors could offend the fairy folk too. If you wore red, that was bad. If you wore, in sort of an inversion of what we associate with St. Patrick's Day, if you wore green, that was actually bad and might get their attention. Sorry to interrupt.
So are fairies bloods or crips? Is the big thing. Like, are they like, what are you supposed to wear when you're in fairyland?
Yeah.
Probably not crips. Probably not crips because they had no blood. Sorry, probably not bloods because they had no blood, rather. The idea was that there are a lot of things that you hear about why fairies had sort of aversions to certain colors. The idea with green was that it was sort of reserved for them. This is our color, don't wear green. That was such a profound fear that a series of sort of disasters, including a fire in Newfoundland, was actually attributed to the issuing of green postage stamps because they felt that the fairies were envious of the green postage stamps. The red color thing, it's interesting. You'll find some lore that says that red could repel fairies, some that red would attract fairies. The idea was that red sort of either reminded them of the fact that they were bloodless, similar to the idea that sharp instruments like knives and whatnot, swords that we've talked about, reminded them that if they got pricked, they wouldn't have any blood and they could never find salvation because they weren't human. That's sort of a Christianized idea of that. Some people said that, the idea that fairies avoided red was, because it reminded them of fire, which we've, talked about a little bit as being sort of a remedy for having fairies, is to claim that fire is part of, as using fire as a threat. So, yeah, there are certain things, those tie into things that you can do to attract or ward off fairies.
Yeah, so let's get practical, Joshua, because a lot of us are going to be this summer going to the national parks. So how, folklore-wise, from all the research you've done, all the cross-cultural connections, how can we protect ourselves and our children? Should we all be wearing iron nails around our neck? Or, what can we do?
Well, I'm putting the iron knife above my baby's bed tonight.
Oh, geez. I do not endorse that. Carrying a bit of iron. There was one folklorist who said that a nail was as efficacious as an iron sword would work. Christian iconography supposedly would work. Carrying around hagstones, which are sort of these stones that you might find by the seaside with some natural holes in them, placed in your pocket might keep them out. Tying a bit of red string around a child was considered a way to prevent them from being abducted. Again, this idea that sometimes it enrages the fairies, sometimes it gets them, sometimes it repels them. It's sort of a crapshoot.
Sure.
All these things, carrying a bit of breadcrumb or a bit of salt in your pocket would also keep them away. The idea, salt has is sort of almost like a primitive antibiotic, but it could also ward off decay and death because it has preservative properties. And bread seems miraculous because it, basically has allowed humankind to have the sort of agriculture as they have. It seems like a divine gift. So those are all things that you could do. But chief among them was always get your baby christened as soon as possible.
Right. Don't get your baby hauled off to fairyland.
Yeah.
Well, Josh, we could talk to you all day about this kind of stuff, and I'm really enjoying the conversation, but we're almost out of time, and I kind of wanted to get to, as someone who, this is your third paranormal themed book, you obviously have a fascination and a really deep knowledge of fairy lore and all this kind of stuff. So as you were going through this particular book, what changed in your perception of the phenomena or in your belief system or anything like that? So when you started the book, did you have a certain set of beliefs that by the end of the book, it had changed your mind or altered your perception?
Yes. Over the course of research, I found more and more problems with hypnotic regression. I think it's an effective tool for behavioral modification, but it's not necessarily effective or shouldn't be used as bulletproof of an experience. Now, at the same time, I do cite a lot of hypnotically regressed, contact experiencers, because even if what happened to them isn't quite as they remember under hypnotic regression, that it's still interesting that there are motivic parallels between their experiences and older folklore. So that's sort of one thing that I came around on. The other thing that I came around on really is that it was disingenuous of me to write off the alien hybridization program as sort of silly bunk, which I honestly did to a certain degree. I still don't think it. I don't think that I don't think that there are a lot of people interpreting it as it for what it truly is. I think that I think that it's more about manipulation and theater, but I think that there's something significant to what's happening to people who recall, being taken aboard a UFO and seeing their hybrid child. Something else that I sort of started to suspect, and again, I hope that I change my mind, because I think that if anybody gets stuck in a mode of thinking, it means that they aren't growing. But I started playing with the idea that the entirety of the paranormal isn't kind of just one big ghost story. I mean, you have this very close fairy association with the dead that we mentioned. There are plenty of parallels that you can draw between the near-death experience and alien abduction. Some alien abductees have actually seen deceased loved ones in the craft. I talk about Bigfoot a little bit in the book. Maybe Bigfoot is a Neanderthal ghost. So sometimes I wonder if we're not just dealing with this giant, as cheesy as it sounds, everything is kind of a spiritual plain ghost story sort of solution to all this. Who knows? I don't know. Like I said, I hope I don't stay there for very long, but that's an idea that sort of that got stuck in me after getting halfway through this book.
That's an interesting thought, Josh, because I had that exact same kind of thing. And that's almost a full circle type of thing, because when you go back to, when we go back to tribal thinking, or we go back to thinking of, before what we consider the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment and all that kind of stuff, everything it's like, this is the work of God, or this is the work of the spirits, and everything is our side, and then the other side, whatever lies over there, and that's going to be, demons and spirits and the dead and all this kind of thing, when now we have this, Bigfoot's actually a certain kind of, like an Australopithecine or something,
right.
We go back to that. And then the aliens come from Cygnus Beta, and, ghosts are actually visitors from a different dimension. So instead of having all of these different cabinets or, categories where we put everything in, this is scientific and this is extraterrestrial and this is spiritual. I've had that same kind of thought, exactly what you're talking about. Like, no, it might just all be the same thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the fact that people are more willing to, because I mean, honestly, the flesh and blood Bigfoot and nuts and bolts alien spacecraft ideas, I think, are a little bit on the wane, and so some of these more alternative ideas are having a little bit more of a resurgence. And I would draw that closely to a sort of mini theory that I've been kicking around in my head of this constant cycle that mankind goes through, from paganism to religion to atheism, which leads to people turning back to paganism, which leads people to wanting to codify it with religion, people rejecting religion in terms of atheism. And if you look at the way that sort of paganism, neo-paganism is on the rise, I wonder if that we're not just seeing sort of the symptoms of that cultural shift in the realm of the paranormal, you know?
Wow. Yeah, and two, you know, I'm doing a close reading of the Mothman prophecies right now, and you know, I'm just surprised about, you know, written in 1975, you know, how applicable it still is today, you know, and how his John Keel's ideas about, you know, hey, I'm not going to get fixated on, you know, different phenomenon. You know, I'm going to look at this holistically and try to determine, you know, what might be going on behind this. So that sounds, you know, like we're very much, all of us are very much in that camp.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, really well put. I think time is going to continue to be kind to John Keel and a lot of his ideas.
And plus, it's a really fun book. Let's not forget that the Mothman Prophecies is a really fun book.
It is. It definitely is.
Speaking of fun books, I want everybody to go out and pick up a copy of Thieves in the Night because, well, maybe stories about child abduction aren't necessarily classified as fun. The exploration of the unknown and getting into all this kind of folklore and classical research and things like that you've done, Josh. It's fun to visit that kind of research and that quality of authorship. And we certainly, I'm a guy that reads a lot of paranormal books, and
Substance.
I'm a guy that hates a lot of paranormal books. It's fun to see some substance, and we want to thank you for that.
I really appreciate
thank you.
it. Thank you so much.
And so if people want to pick up their copy of Thieves in the Night, where can they go get it?
You can pick it up on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. Kindle edition is not out yet, but should be out soon. But so far, paperback from both those vendors. If you want to stay tuned, because I've already had some people asking about a hardcover edition, which my other two books came out, and I don't think there's been any news on that, but you will find updates on all that at my website, joshuacutchin.com, as well as links to where you can buy the book.
Fantastic. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.
Well, let's all make sure our doors are locked when we go to bed.
Absolutely. Well, I got Adeline, my child, is sleeping in the other room, and she's got an iron knife in her hands tonight as she went to bed. That's
perfect.
That's what she sleep with. We arm her with iron before she goes to bed, so the fairies can't change her out.
No need for teddy bears in your house.
Hell no! Now we have iron
Cuddle
knives.
Cuddle up with that iron weapon.
That's right. She knows how to keep safe. 21 months old, she knows how to keep safe. Anyway, we want to thank Josh again. Make sure you check othersidepodcast.com/204. And that's where you're going to find links to all of Josh's books. You can pick up Thieves in the Night right away. I've got a copy. I've made it through about half of it. I haven't finished it yet. But I am going to make it to, not everybody who we have on the show, I read their books to the end. But Josh, I can't wait to get to the end of this book. It's really well done. So make sure you check out Josh's work and pick up a copy of Thieves in the Night. You're going to love it. And, we haven't written too many songs about fairies, Wendy.
Well, that's true. We haven't.
Morgan Le Fay's kind of in that realm.
She's a supernatural character, but not necessarily a fairy.
Yeah, I mean, she's, well, or at least, because she's also is she a witch? Is she a fairy?
Right, that's true. Depends on which version of the story you're talking about.
Right, is she, just the female opposite of Merlin? That's the kind of thing. There's so many versions of the Arthurian legend that, anyway, our version of Morgan Le Fay, we did use that for our last time we had Josh on. We were talking about his last book. But today we wrote a brand new song for Josh, and, just based on what he was talking about, there's a lot of inspiration behind people that suddenly becoming maybe people you don't recognize anymore, doing things that you never believe they did. And sometimes it's a good thing, and sometimes it's a bad thing. But either way, here's a rocker, and this one's called The Changeling. wake-up call for a lifeline, then you go AWOL. You know it's time before you fall to put on the brakes before you hit the wall. So low on the bottom shelf in a black hole is where you find yourself, where you're gonna go when there's no one else to put up with the crap that you're trying to sell. And I don't know if you look lately, but you ain't the same person that you used to be. Whoa, you're the changeling. Whoa, that just ain't my thing. Whoa, you're the changeling. And I don't know if you look lately, but you ain't the same person that you used to be. Till you hurt, play the wrong card and you're in the dirt. In the graveyard calling red alert, you're a cardiac arrest in a mini skirt. So long, that's what you prefer. It's a swan song to who we thought you were. You're so headstrong, put on your spurs and get out of town until you find a cure. And I don't know if you look lately, but you ain't the same person that you used to be. Whoa, changeling. Whoa, that just ain't my thing. Whoa, you're the changeling. And I don't know if you look lately, but you ain't the same person that you used to be.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. You can find us online at OthersidePodcast.com. Until next time, see you on the other side.
The people we really don't want to change are our Patreon community.
No way. They're perfect the way they are.
Right. That if you are a Patreon member of the See You on the Other Side community, you just stay exactly how you are. Like
stay weird.
If I was writing in your yearbook, it would just be stay weird. Have a great summer. See ya next month. See you on the other side. Anyway, our Patreon community, that's where we talk with our members every month about some kind of interesting paranormal topic. We take ideas for the show. We start to foster a relationship about some of the weird topics that we talk about in the show, get feedback, and find out how to make the show better. And the Patreons support what we do. They help make See You on the Other Side, and new songs happen every week.
And they're a lot of fun to hang out with.
Yeah, and that's
Turns
probably
out.
the best. That's probably the best bonus.
It is a great perk. So thank you,
we
Patreons,
enjoy
and
it.
an extra special shout out to our community member, Mr. Dr. Ned, who is
Yes.
pledging us at a level where he gets a shout out every episode, and we're mighty appreciative of your support,
Fantastic.
Ned. Thank you. If you would like to become a member of the See You on the Other Side and Sunspot Patreon
I think you would.
community, how can they do that, Mike? I heard it's really easy.
It's super easy. The fastest way is just to type into your phone or wherever you are right now, OthersidePodcast.com/donate. Climb on board, join the Patreons, get into our next hangout, maybe get a special surprise video, maybe get some interesting discussion that you don't just get to have if you like us on Facebook or whatever. The Patreons are where it's at, and you can join at OthersidePodcast.com/donate.
Thanks for listening.
Well, I want to go back here real quick and just emphasize how gross this stuff is we're talking about.